Alright, let's get into it. SLog2 versus HLG3. I'm going to lay out the pros and cons of both of these picture profiles that I've found through pretty extensive testing. From there, I'll show you guys a couple of sample bits of footage to substantiate the information that I'm giving you. At the end, I'm going to give you the one that I prefer to shoot in and let you know the reasons why. One of the drawbacks for me shooting S-Log2 is that high native ISO. A native ISO of 800 means that when I'm shooting in daylight or bright conditions, unless I have an ND filter or a variable ND filter, I'm going to have to crank my aperture all the way up in order to expose the image properly. If you're wanting to get a nice shallow depth of field, you're going to want to be shooting in a lower aperture, which isn't going to be possible with a native ISO of 800. This isn't an absolute deal breaker, as I mentioned. If you have an ND or a variable ND filter, you can quickly bypass this issue. The next challenge you're facing is S-Log2 tends to be notoriously difficult to expose properly. Now, there are a lot of methods out there that show you how to do it. One that I've used and that has been very effective is exposing 2 stops over. This will give you a pretty good overall exposure on your image. However, if you're fortunate enough to have the gamma display assist feature on your camera, I highly recommend you enable that. You're still going to keep an eye on your exposure meter you're reading at the bottom. You want to keep that on the +2 value, +1.7, +2, that region there. But the image that you see on the LCD screen on the back of your camera is going to have a built-in pretty good saturation and a pretty good contrast, which will give you a nice looking image, easy to judge by the eye when you're setting your exposure on your images. Alright, so now you've got a properly exposed image from your S-Log2. You've done all the previous steps that I've mentioned, and it's time to start grading. Now, this can be pretty intimidating because you've got a pretty flat, muddy looking image, and that's quite hard to work with. If you're not an experienced colorist, you're going to have trouble doing this. My recommendation here is to simply use an S-Log2 to Rec. S7iii LUT. I'll leave a link in the description below to where you can download this LUT, which has been super effective, and I always use it when shooting S-Log2. I use it as my initial color correction, and then from there I grade the image accordingly. I must say I really like the way that this grades the image overall, and I tend to not tweak it all that much. I enjoy the color that it produces from that S-Log2 to Rec. S7iii conversion. Now, in the case that I want to do some additional grading on top of that, this is where my biggest problem with S-Log2 comes. I think all the other objections that I've had up until this point have been fairly overcomable. Either you've got that variable ND filter, or you just learn how to expose the image properly. You can slap on that log2 to Rec. S7iii LUT and your image looks pretty good. You're going to start trying to push it a bit in the grade, and that's where it all falls apart. It's going to introduce a lot of artifacts into your image, and I'll show you some of those a little bit later on. Like I said before, I really enjoy the color being produced when you convert S-Log2 to Rec. S7iii. Personally, I feel it's a fantastic and very cinematic look to your image right off the bat. What I've found is your image is really nice and even overall. You don't have a lot of hotspots, and I think that's attributed to the increased dynamic range that you get out of S-Log2. I think it's meant to have something like 14 stops of dynamic range, which is fantastic. It really gives you a lot of control when it comes to your color grade, so you get the opportunity to determine how bright your lightest areas in your image are and how dark your shadows or your darker areas of the image are. To me, that dynamic range is a huge plus for S-Log2. The next pro that I've identified for S-Log2 might not be as much a pro as it is a slight ego trip. So what happens is when you're grading S-Log2, there's such a dramatic change in your image, going from that washed out, muddy, grey looking image to a bright, vibrant, colourful image, and that's a very satisfying feeling. Onto HLG3, and we'll start off with a couple of pros. Right off the bat, I think that the dynamic range for HLG3 is very comparable to S-Log2. I really don't see a huge difference or benefit, if I'm completely honest, in shooting S-Log2, and I'll demonstrate that to you when I show you some of the footage that I've shot. Next up, HLG3 is a lot easier to expose. The native ISO is much lower. I think it's at 125 if I'm not mistaken, which means that in super bright conditions you don't need an ND or a variable ND filter. You can keep those really low apertures and get a beautiful depth of field in your exposure, something that provides a nice cinematic look to your shots, which is something that I prefer holding onto. HLG3 also tends to be easier to grade. There's a lot less work having to be done once that image comes out of the camera as opposed to S-Log2. HLG3 has a little bit more contrast built in, it seems to be slightly more saturated. All you really have to do is throw on a slight little S-curve on your image, and that's the grade. So if you're in a situation where you're trying to roll out videos quickly, you don't have a lot of time for the edit, I would tend to shoot an HLG3, throw on that S grade, do some white balance correction, boom, you're sorted, easy. To me, the only real con shooting HLG3 as opposed to S-Log2 is the color. Like I've said, I've got a bias towards the color that comes out of S-Log2. It's very cinematic looking. Maybe it's that flat sort of feel that we're getting across the board. You don't have these massive hot spots on your bright areas. But that's something that you can overcome when you shoot HLG3. And how I do that is I just try and match my HLG3 grade to a typical S-Log grade. Now in the grade is an area where I feel HLG3 has a huge advantage over S-Log2, in that the image doesn't fall apart when I'm really pushing it, and I'll show you a couple of examples now. Let's take a look at the grade. Alright, so we're here in Premiere taking a look at some of the footage I recently shot. Now I went out and got this footage specifically to compare HLG3 to S-Log2. So I shot the same image, the same scene under the same lighting conditions, one in HLG3, one in S-Log2. The first one we're taking a look at is the SLog2 footage. So let's add that initial correction to Rec 709. Immediately, this is what I love about the SLog2 grade. Those beautiful skin tones. There aren't really any hot spots, and where it is quite bright, it rolls off really naturally into a good looking skin tone. To me, this is really cinematic looking, and it's something that I tried to recreate when editing the HLG3. Alright, so then what I did is I slapped on a bit more of a grade, so you can see some more brightness, some more contrast, slightly more saturation, and then there's the sharpness. Okay, let's take these all off and then go look at the HLG3. As you can see right off the bat, without any grading, the HLG3's already got a little bit more contrast, a little bit more saturation. It's an easier image to work with. I threw on my custom LUT to try and get it to look closer to S-Log2, so as you can compare, they're fairly similar. The HLG3 is maybe a little bit warmer, but it's comparable. I threw on my further color grade. What that looks like is just upping the brightness, upping a bit of the contrast and the saturation, and then my sharpness, which maybe there isn't a huge difference to. So if you look at the two, I think they're fairly comparable. I must say that the S-Log2, there's still something special that's happening in those skin tones that I can't quite put my finger on, that I do prefer. I feel like I've gotten it pretty close in the HLG3 though. I really can't complain with what I've been able to reproduce here, so I'm quite happy with that. It looks to me like the image is holding up pretty good in both of them. I did mention the artifacts that tend to get introduced when shooting S-Log2, so we're just gonna zoom into the image. Let's find maybe a little dark spot. Let's see here, there's a nice bit of contrast. That's the HLG3, that's the S-Log2. I think they're both holding up pretty well. And if I'm very critical and looking in this area over here, there looks like there could be some artifacts introduced. We've got some like splotches, some red and green splotches coming in, but nothing too intense. There are definitely some red splotches in the finger over there, as opposed to that HLG3. When you take a look at it, the image looks pretty crisp to me. Okay, let's go to another scene that we've shot. Okay, here's a great example of our dynamic range, right? This has already been graded, so I'm just gonna pull off the sharpness, pull off the grade, and I'm gonna pull off that initial correction. As you can see, S-Log2, HLG3, again, more contrast built in, more saturation built in. Easier image to work with. Not much that you have to do in order to get it looking pretty good already straight out of camera. It's a decent looking image. I'm going to throw on my primary correction to get it closer to Rec 709. So as you can see, the S-Log grades beautifully on that skin tone. This is as close as I could have gotten that using my own custom LUT. Look at the dynamic range though. I mean, it's pretty comparable. Over here, the HLG3 looks to be holding up a little bit better. The S-Log2, you've got a bit more detail in or a bit more brightness in the darker areas. But let's go all the way through. So I try to then get my HLG3 looking closer to S-Log2, which I think I did a pretty fair job of. I'm gonna throw on some sharpness. We might see some image degradation or those artifacts that I was mentioning that could come through. So here we go. I'm going to zoom into 400%. This is that S-Log2. Look particularly here on the chest, you've got some red and green splotches. Really bad over there on the shoulder. A little bit in the water here, some purple magenta being introduced. If we flick through to the HLG3, less of it. I don't really think there is much going on with the HLG3 as compared to the S-Log2. Alright, let's zoom out, go take a look at another clip. So what I wanted to draw attention to here were the appearance of the colors. I actually prefer the HLG3's colors here as opposed to the S-Log. This is the S-Log. I'm just going to take off all of my adjustment layers. That's the S-Log. That's the HLG3. Again, as you can see, you can make that image look pretty good right out of camera. Not a lot of work you have to do to it. I'm going to chuck on that first adjustment layer. You can see the S-Log looks a lot better with that first adjustment layer. To me, those yellows are a bit they're too bright, and that's not really what it looked like when I was in the store looking at those sunflowers. That's closer to what it actually looked like. Another adjustment, just up my brightness, up my sharpness, and you can have a look at these two. My personal preference here is the HLG3. I just think the colors look a lot better over here. If we then zoom in, I think the image looks pretty fair on both of them. The S-Log might be a little bit sharper. I think those colors they're just not true to life. That's a lot closer to me. And then this next one, I think this is where you're really going to start seeing, unfortunately, the S-Log fall apart. So let's remove all of the adjustment layers. That's the S-Log. That's the HLG3. I'm going to chuck on that first adjustment layer, trying to get a closer S7iii. That looks pretty good to me in the S-Log. The HLG3 needs a bit more work, so I try to get it closer to the S-Log there. I think that looks pretty darn good. Throwing on sharpness. So here is where, to me, the S-Log absolutely falls apart, and is the reason why I really can't see myself feasibly using it on any projects. This is the HLG3 image. Let's zoom in more, scroll a little bit down. So you might have some slight artifacts happening here in the water. That sidewalk looks pretty good to me. Up in the clouds, that looks alright. Here's another example of, I think the dynamic range holds up really well in HLG3 compared to the S-Log2. As you can see, not a huge difference between the two. What I do notice though is more artifacts introduced on the S-Log2 than the HLG3. You got some magentas pushing through on the clouds. That just looks like a crisper, cleaner image. It's not really falling apart. That, to me, it doesn't look that good, and you really see it evidenced here, sadly. This is the S-Log2, and the water here is absolutely falling apart. The sidewalk here, this little walkway, absolutely falling apart compared to the HLG3. It's a pretty crisp, clean image. Maybe a couple of artifacts being introduced here, some magenta, but here you've got greens, you've got magentas all over this water here. This looks a lot better to me. Let's zoom out just to full screen, and you're saying maybe you're not going to notice it. I've zoomed in a lot. That's why we can see the difference, and looking at it like this, I can see the difference already. I mean, this to me is it's a much better image. It's held together more tightly. It looks better than the S-Log2, and that's really, to me, the big decider as to why I wouldn't use S-Log2 and why I would stick to HLG3. So in summary, I think the dynamic range between S-Log2 and HLG3 is fairly comparable, as I pointed out in some of those images. I do prefer the S-Log2 color, but I feel like I can match the HLG3 pretty close to that S-Log2 color, so it's not a deal breaker for me. And then the final thing that really draws me into the HLG3 is the fact that it holds out better, a lot better in the grade. The image isn't falling apart, it's not introducing any artifacts. And that's why I wish S-Log2 could do better, and I would really love to shoot an S-Log2. But I just feel in 8-bit color, S-Log2 is not the route to go. I think HLG3 is the better option. Maybe if you're shooting 10-bit color, and a couple of videos that I've watched and a couple of articles that I've read do suggest that in 10-bit color, the S-Log holds out really well. And I can't wait to get 10-bit color in my camera here so that I can actually utilize S-Log2 and really score with that dynamic range and really score those beautiful roll-off in the images. Until I manage to get a camera that can shoot in 10-bit color, I'm gonna sideline S-Log2 and keep shooting in HLG3. Let me know in the comments below which picture profile you like to shoot in, be it SLog2, HLG3, maybe one of the cine profiles, and why you choose to shoot in that profile. I'll catch you guys in the next video.